Master, who dwells within this sword of crystal, disperse the fog that blurs my reason. Whisper to me.
In my last video, I discussed the story and lore of Asterion and the Master from the Blasphemous 2 Mea Culpa DLC. I got some great comments on that video discussing alternative theories and other details that I didn't point out in the video that I wanted to share, as well as also discussing a few details that I didn't get to talk about in the original video. And so I decided to make this video as a follow-up. In this video, we'll be discussing how the Anointed Legion might tie into Asterion's Brotherhood, the theory of the miracle masquerading as the Master, the meaning behind Asterion's name, if Asterion was killed by the Mea Culpa, and more. And before we dive in, I'd like to encourage you to like this video if you enjoy the content, subscribe to the Lore Hunter if you want more Blasphemous content, and as always, leave a comment with your thoughts about what we're discussing in the video. Let's get into it. First off, I want to talk about the idea that Asterion and the Master's Brotherhood could be a continuation of the Anointed Legion. I got a few comments about this, and I want to pick out Vincentry446's comment, which says, I've adopted a theory that Asterion's Brotherhood began from the remnants of the Anointed Legion that over the past millennium misinterpreted the events of Blasphemous 1 into becoming what we know now. The connections to Escobar, the entombed body, and the golden sword make sense, being an homage to the Anointed Legion's master. The need for the death of a master so he could provide guidance from the grave, Estros and Perpetua. Even the Mea Culpa chapel being covered in the Anointed Legion's crimson wrappings could be a visual clue to Asterion's allegiance. Thanks for everybody who commented about this, and thanks to Vincentry for your comment, and I think there's some interesting ideas in here, and it's a compelling concept that the Brotherhood could be related to the Anointed Legion from Blasphemous 1. As they mentioned, there's some connections, mainly the crimson ribbon that Asterion wears and that we see used by the Anointed Legion in Blasphemous 1, as well as Asterion using lightning in our fights against him. And speaking about the crimson ribbons, I wanted to touch briefly on this. I got a comment from BrassMonkey2403 who asked, Perpetua, Chrysanta, and Asterion, they all have crimson ribbon, does it mean anything? And there's a lot of things that this crimson ribbon relates to. The characters Perpetua, Estros, and Chrysanta in Blasphemous 1 all wear crimson ribbons because they're all part of the Anointed Legion, who wore crimson wrappings underneath their armor that were blessed by Escobar himself. And then in the Mea Culpa DLC, we see Asterion wearing a similar crimson wrapping, and then in the kneeling church in Santa Vigilia, we also see crimson wrappings everywhere. In the base game for Blasphemous 2, we saw crimson wrappings that were around Chrysanta's sword. In addition, in the Mea Culpa DLC, Annunciata talks about the crimson ribbons in relation to the winds of fate, using that crimson ribbon to open the door that leads to the kneeling church. So to kind of answer the question, yes, I think the crimson ribbons are meaningful. As mentioned, they relate to the Anointed Legion and Escobar's blessing, and they also relate to Chrysanta and her protection and the miracle's power within her sword. In this sense, the wrappings in the new kneeling church in Santa Vigilia could be there in reference to Chrysanta, who kneeled in Blasphemous 1 in the kneeling church and gave Penitente the means to defeat the High Wills through the apodictic part of Mea Culpa. They can also be a reference to Escobar himself and the Anointed Legion, who look to keep the status quo in Blasphemous 1. Either way, the crimson wrappings are tied to the movers and shakers in Blasphemous. There's a lot of possibilities, and I think perhaps getting the full story will give clarity onto the specific significance of the wrappings. But as it stands right now, these wrappings do kind of bring a bunch of main characters together, from Escobar to Chrysanta to Asterion now. And before we move on from Asterion and the Anointed Legion and alliances, I wanted to bring up the fact that before the DLC came out, we saw the design of Asterion, and my first thought was that he had a lot of similarities to the bastard steel enemies that you see here. I sort of visually made the connection in the video, but I didn't say it out loud because within the DLC itself, the Bastard Steel enemies and Asterion, there's not really a connection very explicitly drawn between them, which kind of surprised me. I still think there could be a relation, but there's nothing really beyond the visual similarity at this point. Next, I want to talk about the miracle masquerading as the Master to Asterion, or generally the miracle's hand in guiding Asterion. Xanathar8659 says, I can't help but feel like we're being intentionally toyed with when it comes to the Master. There's so many parallels to Esdras being spoken by the miracle through Perpetua, the High Wheels whispering to Chrysanta, and Escobar's dreams of Penitente. This is echoed by many comments, and we have another comment where they say, I'm willing to think that Asterion, like the paladin in the first game with the dead sister, Esdras, was actually being led astray somewhat by the miracle. So I wanted to speak a moment just about Perpetua and her as an example of the miracle using someone's form and voice to lead someone astray. And what I want to say is that I don't believe that the miracle did speak to Esdras using Perpetua's voice. In Blasphemous 1, Perpetua says to Penitente,
You were able to defeat the lie created by the miraculous zeal that possessed my face and armor, but not my voice, which is now free of sin and dominion.
Perpetua is big on identifying specifically that her voice was not used to manipulate or be a false presence. And my interpretation is that Perpetua is speaking to Esdras and Penitente with her actual voice, and that the miracle, possibly through Esdras' grief, created the false Perpetua in face and armor, but as she says, not her voice. So ultimately, I just don't think that Perpetua is an example of the miracle hoodwinking someone by pretending to be someone else, because I don't think that that happens in Blasphemous 1 with Esdras. And in the case of the High Wills with Chrysanta, they have hardened her heart with the chains. It's not really described as a voice that's manipulating her, it's that her heart has been intentionally hardened by them. And then I would also argue that the High Wills and the miracle are not one and the same, and that there's a bit of a different relationship. Not that the miracle couldn't change and sort of develop manipulation tactics between Blasphemous 1 and 2, but as I mentioned in the video, I don't think we've seen evidence that the miracle does manipulate people in that way. That being said, Xanathar does bring up an interesting point about Annunciata and what she says in the Mea Culpa DLC. There's also the note about the miracle rewriting the Scrolls of Destiny, echoing Annunciata being told by a distant voice that she was to create Mea Culpa. It's like we have so many pieces of the puzzle, we're only missing one piece, but depending on what that one piece is, it could reshape the entire picture as we know it. Once again, thanks to Xanathar for commenting, and I totally agree that there does seem like the theories and speculation that we're doing right now could go different ways depending on how the pieces actually fall with the entire picture of Blasphemous 2 with future DLC. Because Annunciata's comment about the miracle with its beauteous quill does throw into question the authorship of the miracle and the potential of it being the voice that spoke to Annunciata. So I think it's a valid alternative interpretation. I think that the miracle is doing some sort of games here and that it's making moves in order to influence fate. I still hold to the idea that the miracle doesn't really act except through other people, and so I don't know that this would happen per se, but I think it's worth keeping in mind. Ultimately, I've chosen to go with the interpretation that the Master is the voice speaking to Asterion, and that it is the Brotherhood who is doing the moving and shaking and plotting and planning and has their goal. And I think that also is a stronger emotional core for Asterion's arc and just a more interesting story. So I do have that bias where I just like Asterion and his master and their relationship being a true thing where he's not being played with. And also in this case, the master also does seem to still be kicking it at the end of the DLC. So I do think that the master being the one who is speaking to Asterion, and then for whatever reasons, as we will find out, resurrects, comes back to life, cracks the crystal of his sarcophagus. I think, that's him moving forward in a plan or coming up with a new plan. And I just like that more for the master's character as well, if he's a force to be reckoned with in future content. Next, I want to talk about something that wasn't commented on, but was something I was considering during the creation of the video, and it's something I didn't reach a conclusion on, but still wanted to throw out there for discussion and just point out what I have observed while not having like a definitive conclusion or tying it into everything, and that's the meaning behind Asterion's name. Asterion is the name of a few people in Greek mythology, the most famous of which would be the Minotaur in Greek mythology, and Asterion means starry. My first thought is that Blasphemous has themes of bulls and bullfighting related to Spanish culture, which I discuss in my Blasphemous critique video, and how the relationship of the church to the congregation is akin to a bullfighter and a bull. And I think you could also draw some parallels between the Greek myth of Theseus and the bull and Penitente and Asterion. I don't have a strong conclusion for any of this, and I feel like saying more is kind of just speculative, but I think it is potentially the bull sort of minotaur aspect of Asterion's name that's being the significance or the choice of naming this character Asterion. But I would love to hear any comments you might have about Asterion's naming, and if there's any significance that I may have missed or anything that you'd like to add about the meaning of Asterion's name. Next, I want to discuss Asterion being killed by the Mea Culpa and why his connection with the Master was severed. There's a bunch of comments about this, but I think Watermelon8764 sort of sums it up pretty well by saying, "The second time the Penitent One defeats Asterion, he does it with Mea Culpa, the sword that slays miracles and the holy. That may be the reason he loses his connection with the Master, his faith, and his hope, unlike the first time he got defeated." And I think this is a really solid idea because we know that the Mea Culpa, its significance is that it is able to hurt the divine. It killed the High Wills in Blasphemous 1, and it was forged before the true ending in Blasphemous 1 as a means to defeat the last son of the miracle. And of course, in my video, I speak at length about why the Brotherhood and Asterion would want to possess the Mea Culpa and their motivations and how that ties in. But I think it is an interesting point to say that, oh, the Mea Culpa was the reason that Asterion and his connection to the Master was severed because of the power of that weapon. So I think it's a really good idea, and the main issue that I see arising from this theory is just that there's nothing that guarantees that Asterion is killed by the Mea Culpa or that Mea Culpa is ever used on him, because you don't have to use Mea Culpa in your fight against him. In Ending C, you can use any weapon to defeat Devotion Incarnate, but in the cutscene, Chrysanta uses Mea Culpa on him specifically. I think that if the significance of his death was through Mea Culpa, that they would have underlined it in a similar way, either through a cutscene, dialogue, or even a prompt, similar to what we got with Chrysanta in Blasphemous 1, where it shows Mea Culpa being the thing that severs the connection or that kills Asterion. But because we don't get anything like that, I'm unsure that the Mea Culpa is why Asterion's connection with his master was severed. In another comment from Lord 7, they offer this idea: what if the connection was severed because the master's resurrection had begun? He could only hear his master while he was far and near, supposedly in one of the afterlives, meaning if the master started to revive and therefore threaded back into the waking world, there would be no way to establish the connection and speak to him. And I think this is a really good theory that plays with the rules of the metaphysics established within the world. It makes sense to me that if the master is being resurrected, that Asterion is no longer having that same connection because he's coming into the waking world, as Lord 7 says. So I just wanted to give a shout out to that theory because I think it's possible and it's something I didn't think of and I wanted to throw out there for the community to chew on. And before we wrap up talking about the Mea Culpa and what kills Asterion, it's a little bit of a pedantic point, but it is worth noting that Asterion is wounded by the fight with Penitente, but ultimately appears to have died from gravity and cobblestones. Either way, it's a tragic moment for the devoted Asterion, who lost his guiding voice and then chose to toss himself from the ledge. And there you have it, some more about Asterion and the Master. Thanks for all the comments and discussion from the previous video, and the comments that'll be coming on this video, I'm sure. I really look forward to seeing where the story of Blasphemous 2 ends up with the Master, and if any of these theories ultimately prove true and pan out how we're describing them. Regardless, it's always a blast sharing my passion for storytelling and Blasphemous with all of you, and I consider myself blessed by the miracle to get your comments in return. Speaking of comments, leave one on this video about your thoughts regarding Asterion and the Master. And while you're at it, also give the video a like if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the Lore Hunter if you haven't for more Blasphemous content. Thanks for watching.